when things go wrong, and they do in technology, it's inevitable, the government's going to be transparent and open about it. And so the underlying trust that people have, I think, is less in the technology per se, but in the sort of civic algorithm behind it, which is ultimately the people running things, that they're accountable, that they're transparent. And I think that we are very conscious of the fact that we could lose that trust. Maybe as a third driver of digitalization in Estonia, which is we're deeply antisocial. And Estonians love to avoid face-to-face contact. So for instance, our online, our census gathering is now completely registry-based. And that fact is very popular because Estonians are grateful that it's one less bit of human contact with some bureaucrat knocking on their door. There's a little humor to this, but I do think that sort of, we hear in some countries that, well, we can't digitize the service because people want to have the face-to-face interaction with the bureaucrats. The old lady wants to come in and sit in the government office and talk to the civil servants and chat about things. And no Estonian, would ever identify with that.
Hi, welcome back to the show. I'm T+. In this episode, we'll continue our conversation with Lucas and Audrey about the role and transformations of e-governance or digital services. Both of you have been mentioning Ukraine, so I want to talk more about that. There has been a lot of interesting digital services deployed during war to ensure digital service provision. Lucas, Estonia has played a big role in supporting Ukraine provide digital services. Can you tell us about this collaboration?
Yeah, the prehistory before we get to the war is quite interesting. So in 2019, Estonia has been working really closely with the Ukrainian government basically since the Euromaidan in 2014 around a lot of reforms, not just digital. Basically, they are a fellow traveler of ours in this sort of post-communist, post-Soviet space. And when there is a country in the region that is making a big push toward democracy, toward openness and good governance, we want to be there because we want to be in a world where our neighborhood looks a bit more like us and a bit less like Russia. So we were involved to some extent in 2014. But when President Zelensky was elected, he was elected on the sort of platform of transforming how the country works. And he came here a few months after his election with Mikhailo Fedorov, his digital minister and deputy PM. And basically he said, look, what you guys have done with e-Estonia, we want to do that in Ukraine. Mikhailo, you go do this. And that's not unique. Plenty of presidents and prime ministers have come to Estonia, they've seen the marketing, they've seen what's behind it, and they said, this is really cool, we want to do the same thing. The thing where Ukraine really stood out is they actually went and did it. So they're very conscious of it. They copied X-Road. A lot of the individual registers and systems, they basically brought in Estonian experts, rebuilt or built from scratch what had happened in Ukraine, what was done in Estonia. They sort of took our legal framework for EID and signatures. There was through our e-governance academy, there were a whole lot of Estonians kind of constantly going back and forth between Kiev and Tallinn, sort of helping with this. But they also improved on it because, of course, they were doing this in 2020. And so there were organizational assumptions that they could make that we didn't 20 years ago. They said, okay, we're going to have to very consciously run this like a startup within government. We're going to have this sort of toolkit of what you do today to design and deliver a service around A/B testing, agile development, constantly running, various iterations of your product through user groups to get that feedback, marketing well, so not just sort of building something that's technologically competent, but also thinking about the marketing, how that pulls people along with the service, and of course being mobile first. So Dia, their mobile app, their kind of government super app, is something they kind of developed over that period. And it's just a really well done app. And the app is good on a technological level, but also sort of the whole business process behind that and how they are constantly onboarding new services, getting people to use it, kind of predetermines to them to success. So they're big. When you set yourself up like that, then you are opportunistically ready for challenges. So when the pandemic happened, they said, okay, let's throw our COVID certificate into Dia, and we'll say, people, you want a COVID certificate, you have to download the app. So immediately they had basically half the population using the app. And then when the war hit, what it meant was that the innovation that they've done, where they basically developed new services in days and weeks, things like the ability to take pictures of and register destruction, the results of bombing, both to receive compensation, refugee support, but also to build up the case for war crimes against Russia, or an authenticated chat channel where you can report on movements of the enemy. And that information goes to military commanders who then use that to gather more intelligence and ultimately launch counterstrikes. The remarkable thing is that they were able to do this in days and weeks, and they had that organizational infrastructure in place. So they had the teams, they had the mindset, and it was sort of on February 24th, they kind of had to retask themselves to a new set of challenges. And those challenges are massive, and I don't want to downplay the difficulty of dealing with them. But the point is that they were at that point, they were 2 or 3 years into this process, where again, I think we're really proud that we could give them some impetus, but that dynamism they built themselves, that's not us. Or we've gotten to the point where basically, we said we actually have a lot to learn from this. So we are consciously now, we talk a lot about sharing our experience, and as Taiwan does, we make out the code that we've procured, that we developed public. We've launched some multinational collaborations, for instance, to develop the Xroad as an open source tool. But the biggest obstacle today for advanced countries is not, do you share your stuff? It's, do you use the stuff that others have built? And so, we looked at what Ukraine was doing. We bona fide said, we don't have anything like this. We're still working on a good mobile government app. We had a roadmap to build it ourselves. We said, you know what? Let's copy what they've done instead. And so what we're now doing is we're building with Ukraine based on the DIA code base, an Estonian version of the app. It's currently going through security testing, which is really important. The MVP is going to go into some user testing, I hope in about a month. And then our goal is to release it publicly by the summer. And initially it's going to have a few features, but then we've got a roadmap to put more and more functionality in there. And now the discussion we're having with Ukraine is like, okay, it's cool that Estonia also has a nice app, but that's not the end game. The end game is, what can we now do together to bring this elsewhere? And one of the things that we've already learned from the 5 years of building Xroad together with Iceland and Finland is there's an immediate benefit around having the code together. There's cost saving. We get Xroad as a product that's continuously developed and updated, less expensively doing it with Finland and Iceland than we get ourselves. But there's also a separate benefit, which is you then also have a developer community, you have a user community, you have values and communication that are also multinational. And so as we're talking with Ukraine about what the future for DIA and our app is, part of the question is, well, how do we actually get all these communities multinationally to be contributing to the same code being run by governments? And I don't think that's going to be an experiment. And I would say that the challenges and the opportunities for a user-facing app on millions of devices are an order of magnitude greater than they are for backend infrastructure and software. I mean, Xroad is a very useful tool, but it's never going to have more, the user numbers are always going to be in the thousands. In Estonia, it's 1,000 plus public sector and private sector entities. In a larger country, it might be 10,000 or 100,000. There's never going to be in the millions directly using it, whereas an app is. And so I think we're kind of entering an interesting period where civic tech isn't national anymore, in the same way that other parts of open source are very multinational. And that is scary too. We talked again before about the security sort of elements. It's scary to a bunch of people who, in Estonia's case, their number one focus is, how do I keep Russia out of my supply chain? And the second question is, they're all thinking about what are the risks to the supply chain from the PRC, to then say, but we're going to run all this sort of core stuff, and it's open source, and there's a global community developing it. That's scary. And some of those questions are legitimate. There are real risks to open source projects where you don't know how stuff's gotten stuck in there, and you don't always have the governance in place to check everything. So I don't want to minimize those. We can't just wave our hand and say, well, the community will take care of it. But again, we have to sort of build and fund the processes that do take care of those challenges, but ultimately give us the benefits.
Indeed, incorporating public code from other countries to run in a place that requires a lot of trust, require the infrastructure of, as I mentioned, defense in depth, resilience, so that even if it's malicious, it's like lure into a honeypot and so on. And we've got the National Institute of Cybersecurity, freshly launched, that dedicates the work to that. Because we need, for example, to plan for the day when a large earthquake or some fishing vessels cuts all our submarine cables connecting Taiwan to the world. And when that happens, all we have then is non-geostationary satellites. But in those cases, the whole topology changes. The public cloud, whether it's a local zone or a local region, now counts a lot because even only the metadata is sent from Taipei to Tokyo. That's the bandwidth we cannot spare in those times. And so decentralized technology and so-called Web3, interplanetary file system, and so on, gain a prominence in such scenarios. So by necessity, we have to use these public code. For example, the element matrix, which on the user experience viewpoint is maybe not the perfect one for instant messaging. However, it's perfect when you are in this kind of scenario where only 700 satellite receivers can work among themselves in a federated setting and nobody has full bandwidth to the external world. And so we have to basically invest in the red team testing, penetration testing, localization, making the user experience fit the Taiwanese experience of instant message and so on, and basically localize this whole experience of element matrix as the French and German governments have done. And the super app seems like a great next target for the National Institute of Cybersecurity to localize so that we can work together. Yeah.
That was very insightful. Thank you, Lucas. Now, we've been talking about the importance of open source tools. But one challenge these tools have is that there are so many iterations and versions of these models that they don't always work together. How do you work around these issues?
And I think when we talk about openness, I mean, since we have to talk about OpenX, it's not just open source, right? It's open data, it's open specs, there's a whole kind of the stack. And sometimes, I think we over-index a bit on open source. I mean, open source is a very important principle when the government itself is procuring or running the software. And as in any business, there are going to be core business areas where you want to do it yourself because it's core to the, it's central to the nature of the business. So how government entities exchange data with each other in the private sector, it's in the 21st century, a core function of bureaucracy. On the other hand, do I need to have open source office software? I'm going to leave aside the question of, whether Microsoft has a monopoly and all that, but inherently, does it have to be open source? I feel less strongly about that than I do about, our data exchange protocol, but I do care that the specs and the requirements are open enough that I'm not locking myself in the long run. And, in a lot of systems today, I mean, the code is becoming less important. We're in a world of, low code, no code. AI is going to be writing things. So probably what matters more is the openness of the algorithms, the openness of the data that's being worked on. So I think that we should sort of, open source is a means, not an end in its own right. And I think we need to sort of always come back to the broader mandate of open, transparent, accountable government and re-ask ourselves, what are the specific tools that take me there today? And so to get to the question you asked, which is, well, how do we deal with the sort of the question of forking and maintaining products? I mean, two points. One is when we're building products and maintaining them, I think it's more than just the code base. We really do want to have common products and services. We may still be running local instances, but with what we do today with X-Road, with Finland and Iceland, and a lot of other countries participate, the commitment is to be using sort of not just at some point we've got a common code base, but really we're commonly developing this and we're putting resources into the roadmap. So, I mean, what's happened is basically the product owners in our digital government agency that used to kind of spec the requirements themselves and go out and either develop it or procure it, they now sit with the product owners in Iceland and Finland. They come up together with what are sensible requirements. And sometimes it's a messy conversation because there are needs that Estonia has that Finland doesn't have and so on. And you always have the risk of design by committee. So there is a balance there. But the fundamentally the exercise they're engaged in is to align what their needs are enough that they can actually use the same product. And I think it's important for things we do ourselves. It's also something we should be doing for commercial software. I mean, I think the interesting discussions I've had with colleagues, in this broader question of, well, how do we deal with the fact that in cloud, in office and productivity and other areas that we have, either monopolies or oligopolies. There are a whole range of means to take, and I won't get into the whole competition law discussion, but one of the very practical things we can do is also to be more of a monopsony, so a single set of buyers, which is to say align more on what our requirements are. So, if Estonia wants to see a particular feature around transparency or native interoperability with PKI built into Office, and we ask Microsoft for that, they're going to say, look, that's really nice, but you guys are maybe, from the public sector, a few tens of thousands of users. We have a lot of other customers that are tens of thousands of users. Now, if Estonia and then, countries representing another 50 million users just from their public sector ask for that, that's market power. And that can actually impact the conversation. So I think that sort of if I generalize the organizational challenge, it's that the problems and the challenges that we are all doing kind of in our national silos, we need to sort of start aligning on more programmatically. We do that a bit in Europe, although it's kind of clunky and it's imperfect. But I think also Europe is sometimes similar enough, European countries similar enough to each other that we become our own monoculture. So, I mean, I would love to align and, compare working plans and sort of what our annual agendas are, with Audrey, and sort of work on that. We've not, the courageous thing we haven't quite gotten to is to write those in a wiki form. This year, we're going to make everything public in it to an extent we haven't before. But why not in a couple of years have that be a wiki form? And the next step is you actually have templates, right? We can build, sort of policy goal kind of building blocks, and then you can have the generic template for what a good broadband policy or what a good open source policy be developed in a more collective way, and then you have to localize it as a policy, but you actually kind of in localizing it have some sense of confidence that you're already building on best practices and research that's been done collectively. And the challenge, that we've got in a tiny country is the cognitive overhead of just looking at what everyone's doing in the world. If we have to do that as our own exercise, it's a big effort. If I want to say, let's find out what the best approaches in the world to open source are, and someone has to go and research that, that's going to take them time. I don't know that they're actually being exhaustive. I don't know how good their expertise is. Whereas if that's been put together by a community and kind of it's a wiki of good open source policies, I've got much more confidence that I can run with that and I can start doing it right away.
Yeah, maybe we should set up a workshop in the Open Government Partnership Summit that's going to take place in Estonia.
Yes.
Yes, my team will be there, and I'll be there too, schedule permitting, so that we can plan this together. Yeah.
There are a couple of pre-events I want to talk to you about, which I can't mention now because we're not ready to announce publicly yet. But,
okay.
I hope to fill your calendar for that week.
Okay, excellent. Let's make that happen. And I think this really is a great point about this monopsony thing, because all the successful negotiations we did with the Facebooks and Microsofts and Apples and Googles of the world, we did it with people in the government, other governments sharing the same values and sentiments. In fact, when I signed the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, the DFI, along with Ukraine and I believe Estonia, I think that's what we have in mind. It is this common set of values that drives our procurement, our digital strategy, our plannings together. And that is what we will then collectively say, okay, the private sector better implement this because sooner or later we'll figure out how to ensure that this is not just legally sound, but this is what our citizens come to expect. Yeah.
Speaking of collaborative efforts, I want to turn back to the war in Ukraine and ask Lucas, what do you think the world will learn and what might change in terms of digital service provision?
It's sort of, Audrey talked about some of the very specific communications resilience problems that Ukraine, Ukraine has it easier because at least Western Ukraine has lots of cable connections to the global internet. So their kind of connectivity problem has been a local one. We're a bit sort of, oddly enough, although we're not an island, our situation is a little bit more comparable to yours because along with Latvia and Lithuania, we are effectively an island where the other half is just a land border with Russia, but that's kind of it's more of a black hole than the ocean is. So I think those principles emerge from there. And, I think the interesting question also for Ukraine is going to be, how do they keep going once they no longer have the pressure of the war? Because I think the thing with these crises is, in a crisis like this, when it is existential, everyone's interests are aligned. And a lot of the usual sort of reasons for different parties, either internally within an organization or across the whole country, not to collaborate, they kind of go away and they get deprioritized. But that's a temporary phenomenon. And I'm sure you've seen this with the pandemic. I mean, that people are not as worried anymore, and all the sort of usual administrative organizational agendas come back. And Ukraine will certainly have this gravity too, which is when it gets to rebuilding. I mean, you have massive rebuilding effort to do. There's going to be, it's not going to be zero-sum logic, but it's going to be a question of do we rebuild your schoolhouse or my schoolhouse? And so that's just an inevitable part of the process. And I think what I have faith in my Ukrainian colleagues, but what will be hard for them is to keep that momentum going. And I think it's true for a lot of these efforts. Is how we keep the momentum going. How do we do it when it's not existential? Because thankfully, I mean, if we're constantly in an existential threat, the problem is our limbic systems can't handle it. If you're running on adrenaline all the time, at some point you crash and you collapse. And that's not a very kind of humane way to do things.
Yeah, that's a great take. So yeah, I remember when the Ministry of Digital Affairs was being designed, it was almost like a modeling after this Taiwan success story of the semiconductor industry. We're going to digitally transform our software industry so that we have more silicon shields than just the TSMC and so on. And then Ukraine happened. And then all the conversation became, instead, how can we ensure that defending Taiwan is going to make it more costly for the attackers, because in especially cybersecurity, but also the resilience, usually the attackers had it easy because they just have to pick the weakest link and attack there, whereas the defense need to spend a lot of resources safeguarding all the different parts in the software supply chain and the installations and so on. But then the Ukraine experience with this very agile team of the DIA team essentially shown is that by tapping into the global network infrastructure of the largest public cloud providers and everyone else, and the crypto community wiring them funds in real time, they get to tap into this global resilient infrastructure that actually dwarfs the attackers, cybersecurity attackers, the red teams, like by an order of magnitude. And so the main thing we learned is that we cannot afford to be a silo anymore. To be resilient, we need to interoperate with the likes of DIA and X-Road and so on, because that really is the only chance that we have to make sure that this works in the defendant's favor instead of in the attacker's favor.
And just reflecting on things, I mean, that's something that you just put into words in a way which I didn't answer when we talk about what we've learned from Ukraine. That's one last thing is, I mean, Ukraine's success has been primarily Ukraine's success, but also it's been mobilizing a lot of collective resources from across the world. If it were just Ukraine versus Russia, the playing field would look very different today. And we live in enough of a networked world. Part of it's governments. I mean, let's not kid ourselves, but it's not only governments. If I look at the civil society contributions that have been made in Estonia on every level, tech and non-tech, certainly, and across the world, that is part of what they've been able to mobilize. And we then get into this broader discussion on, what system, what type of system is more capable of handling the challenges of the 21st century. If we're kind of doing the autocracy versus democracy balance sheet, one of the things that we have to put in the democracy balance sheet today in a network world is that I would claim democracies can better sort of tie into global networks than autocratic systems can. Certainly Ukraine proves that. And I think that's a challenge to think about, which is not just how do we do our governmental task well, but how do we help all of our different networks across the country, human and technological, have tendrils into sort of the rest of the world. I think one of the things actually in Estonia, part of that networking occurs naturally by virtue of the European process. And so we're we don't think about that. I mean, it almost kind of goes without saying to us that things are economically really integrated with our neighbors. You've got people constantly going cross-border, et cetera, and we're fish in water enough that is a reality that we almost forget about. I don't know that means we build a global European Union, but I think that it's precisely what we'll be discussing at the OGP and where democracies have to stick together that sort of comes out in this kind of conversation.
Yes, let's free the future together as free democracies. Yeah.
Indeed, a key takeaway from this conversation is that learning from other similar countries is highly beneficial. I'm curious, Audrey, how do you think about digital policy and resilience? Are you always preparing for existential threats?
Yeah, so last August, when our website moda.gov.tw, could be HTTPS or IPNS, went online, the same hour, we suffered the largest DDoS attack in Taiwan's history. In a single day, 23 times more than the previous peak took down the websites for the Ministry of National Defense, Presidential Office, you name it, Foreign Affairs, and so on. And then I said publicly that the Moda website stay online and down not even for 1 second. And of course, a lot of free testing was done against our website. Of course, we still stayed up. And I remember fondly that the largest Silicon Valley cybersecurity companies, the Protocol Labs and others in the Web3 world and so on, all wrote me, like directly email me and say that resource is not the problem. And we're willing to throw as much resources as it needs to mitigate this attack. So this speaks to the point that Lucas just made, which is the democracies have a tendency of banding together in moments like this, and we're very much open to this kind of assistance. So to me, it is not about nation to nation or state to state cooperation in the traditional like track one diplomacy way, but rather we named our department Democracy Network, not international cooperation, because we see ourselves as just one node in the democracy network. And if the logic of the democracy network is that of interoperability, then we see the defense not as an existential threat of one single node, but a chance for the network to grow, to come alive. Because the network is only as alive as people's sense of common urgency. So instead of just one node suffering, from an existential crisis and everybody else feeling pity, right? We are instead rephrasing this problem as how can we structure our defenses together so that everybody put in just a little spare hard disk, just a little spare bandwidth, and then all our website contents and announcements and so on can stay afloat. So to answer your question quite directly, I think not in terms of the existence of one node or another, but rather on the topology and how we can configure the topology so that by inviting participation, we can make progress and be safe at the same time.
Speaking of cyber attacks, Estonia faced large cyber attacks in 2007, but there were even bigger attacks last year that didn't make as big an impact. How did Estonia mitigate the potential damage of these attacks?
Look, I mean, 2007, we had these sort of massive DDoS attacks back when massive DDoS attacks were an uncommon thing. So, yes, there were security teams in public and private sector. Yes, there have been DDoSes, but it wasn't they didn't have the level of facility and preparedness. And also, our global bandwidth wasn't what it is now. And so one of the threats is basically this was just sort of literally clogging all the pipes. That was sort of the actual DDoS attack itself. It was mitigated and handled within sort of hours and days, and there were some scary moments there. But it was also sort of the bigger background realization, and why I think this is called Web War One, was it was the first time, or one of the first times, where a nation-state actor, it was Russia, even if they've sort of used plausible deniability, which is one of the facets of cyber attacks, combine this with other sort of means of accomplishing the geopolitical end. So, there were riots in the street at the same time. The sort of political end of the Russian government, as far as we can tell, was to facilitate a change in government. Maybe not a revolution per se, but basically to have the coalition government step back and have a more Moscow-friendly government take power. And that failed. And that failed for a combination of reasons, of which the fact that the chaos they wanted to sow with the DDoS attacks didn't pan out was part of it. I mean, if we look at Russia's military tactics, their aim is to do a kind of lightning warfare where they basically disorient and confuse the population and they come in and quickly mop up. I mean, that's what they wanted to do in Ukraine. And indeed, we know that Russia had either penetrated or attempted to penetrate all of Ukrainian critical infrastructure in the run up to the war. And what we can infer their plan was that they were going to cut the power, cut the telecommunications, cut the banking services, so that everyone would be sitting in Kiev on February 24th kind of clueless and disoriented and confused, and then they would just sort of show up in Kiev with their tanks. Now, a whole lot of things went wrong, and some of them had to, a lot of that had to do with javelins, but part of what went wrong is that the Ukraine had, over the previous 6 months, with the help of allies, sort of very methodically cleaned out their critical infrastructure, public and private. So the 0 days just didn't work. They weren't there. And these exploits take time and expertise to place. In some sense, I think the risk that we have in a conversation like this between Audrey and myself is that we go into the details. We go on like, do this for cybersecurity, do that for cybersecurity. The executive level challenge is just think about it and put resources into it. So one of the things that we've been working on is how do we take all that complexity and reduce it to a level of simplicity that head of an organization can actually deal with and can make choices based on. That a minister or a CEO can sort of use operationally, where the government can then sort of push that in the right direction. And the very simple measure is money is still the measure of all things. We've been trying to think about how do we consistently and usefully measure the resources put into cybersecurity. And that's not an easy thing, because if you open up sort of IT spend and you try and kind of attach a tag on whether security spend or just infrastructure spend, it's sometimes very hard to figure out. But the goal is that we can sort of set very generally a target of how much either overall spending organization or how much of your IT spend should be going on information security and cybersecurity, and then manage that at a kind of societal level. So that's an indicator. We look at every government agency, every ministry, and look and ask, okay, like let's say the benchmark's 10% of IT spend. Now, spending 10% of your IT spend on cybersecurity isn't automatically going to mean that you're doing things right. And not spending 10% doesn't automatically mean you're doing things wrong, but it's an indicator. If someone's spending 15%, they probably have thought about the resource allocation. There's some more systematicity there. If they're spending 5%, maybe that's an indicator we need to look at what they're doing and talk to them. The same thing's true for the private sector, right? If we set a kind of broad, non-binding target, it'll vary by industry. But again, it's something where the expectation we have is that a board would look at this, would figure out the number, and as part of their fiduciary responsibility as a board of a company, uses this as a KPI to figure out whether they're doing the right stuff. And so that's something we're developing now. I know a couple of other countries have been working on sort of similar methodologies. The EU is now starting to have a discussion. I would say, having just had some meetings in the last week, looking at the sort of the methodology and progress, it'll be a year or two until we're confident that we actually have a methodology that we can then make binding in government or non-binding in the private sector. We're piloting it this year. Part of the challenge is it moves the budgeting cycle. So, to figure out if it's a useful tool, you have to go through a budgeting cycle and see how kind of people plan based on it. But this is one example of reducing the complexity. And reducing the complexity is, I think, kind of the strategic imperative that we have also on a lot of the question of, our users. Because the truism in cybersecurity is it's all human error. And that's an easy truism, and it's a nice way for the tech people to go and blame the end user. But then the design challenge is, how do we build our systems, both our own governmental systems and what's out there in the private sector, in such a way that is less susceptible to human error? And so, we talked about EID as one of the things that I think we got right. We weren't necessarily doing that in a cybersecurity paradigm 20 years ago. But how do we, do everything from, avoiding malware intrusion through government email to, how we guide people in what their hardware technology choices are in a way that makes them security aware, but doesn't make them go nuts. And part of the role of government is to design ecosystems where things are fairly safe and functional and sandboxed within that ecosystem, and where not everyone has to engage with the full complexity of everything. I mean, imagine if we all had to engage with the complexity of aviation safety. No, I don't think about safety when I'm choosing between airlines because I just kind of assume it's been solved. And indeed, the budget airlines, in the developed world often today have better safety records than the expensive state-owned carriers. So it's no longer a cost-safety correlation. I think there's a similar challenge that we have when it comes to cybersecurity, which is maybe it's not the level of airlines because the trade-off is, it's super regulated and you're not, product innovation and building aircraft is a, decades-long cycle. But there are going to be components of digital technology there are components that are just as foundational and architectural, and there'll be other things where, move fast and break things.
Yes, completely. I think a lot of the government's work is to shape the norms, but we do not need to invent those primitives from scratch. Just like, for example, the crypto world, a lot of our privacy enhancing technologies, in particular zero knowledge, comes from that world because that world is like the airlines, right? If it comes crashing down, well, they lose billions. And then there's a lot of adversity, scammers and so on in that particular environment. And so they're very much motivated to invent things that actually work mathematically. When that happens, then we can take bits and pieces of that, and then say, oh, these are now the defaults in the more civilian world, right? So I think a lot of this adversity, when you look at the highly regulated industries, usually there was a large scam or large crash or other existential crisis to that industry that happened some points at their history, and so they have a culture of inventing the primitives that we can then take a easier to introduce version and then become the baseline, the default.
This metaphor about air travel is interesting, but the difference between air travel and cybersecurity is that cybersecurity requires all users to be a part of the process. How do you think about this when you are building systems to prevent cyber war?
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on that question a bit already, but maybe just to kind of pull it together, it's going to be a balance. Of course, having them be aware of things and having them recognize this is something you have to think about, but really, building our design processes and the product so that they're not constantly exposed to all of that. I mean, the broad comparison I'd make to this is like if we think about cyber attacks today, we live in with the exception of Ukraine right now, in a generally peaceful world, a system where national borders kind of mean that the threats you have within one border are contained to that country, and advanced countries do a very good job at dealing with internal security threats and giving having their population live in a fairly safe bubble. And then you've got the cyber world where I'm constantly under threat from Iranians, North Koreans, Russians, nasty commies everywhere. And there's nothing I can do about it. And the national border isn't defending me from that. And the Westphalian system isn't defending me from that. So, why I kind of harp on the fact that yes, we have to educate our users, and yes, we have to sort of be user-centric in how we design things. There is a role of government to bring a little bit of that sort of, bring us back into a world in which the average person actually, doesn't have to constantly worry about things. I'd like to have it closer as a paradigm to air travel than crossing a street. And maybe that's a metaphor, right? Let's maybe a better metaphor than airplanes is what we're doing with traffic, right? And the future of cities, which is, we used to say, okay, users have to be responsible for not crossing when there's a red light. But we build 10-lane roads with lots of cars that could mow them down if they made a mistake. And I was saying, guys, also because we want people to use other forms of mobility than cars, we still have to teach people not to cross at a red light, but let's also build our streets and our traffic and our speed so that people, even if they do make that mistake or some kid runs on the street, they don't get mowed over, because actually we have 2 lanes of traffic moving 30 kilometers an hour next to a whole bunch of multimodal stuff and bikes and people walking in a 15-minute city that's safer. So I think that's kind of like the ecosystem design is like, instead of safety being seatbelts and traffic lights, let's move to safety being a 15-minute city that is fundamentally sort of more human-centric. That's a metaphor I came up with right now, but I don't know if that sticks, Audrey, if that speaks to you too.
Yes, and as someone who even a decade ago used to carry very large laptops and batteries around in international travel, I know that airport security is a thing. So it's the airplane is safe because people invested a lot in airport security, right? So basically design such a system so that the security happens. For example, like our counter-pandemic at the border quarantine centers, so that it becomes the norm. And once it becomes the norm, people normalize that, and then they get to enjoy the films and food on the airplane. So I think then our duty as institutional designers is to make sure that the best designers in experience design, system design, and so on come to work in this very important problem and pay this investment upfront so that people can then, like with some airport security checks, get to enjoy most of the ride together.
We're nearing the end of our show, and it's been exciting to hear from both of you. Before we go, I would like to ask Lucas, so many services are available online in Estonia. What's next for Estonia?
Yeah, I mean, it's not digitizing more things. It's actually having iterating on the digitized stuff and having it work better and better. Actually, I mean, one of the things is reducing the number of services. There's too much complexity in simplifying things a bit, both for the users and simplifying things also, frankly, for the people running it in the background. And then connecting the digital more clearly to the overall business goals of government. We have too much people doing the digital for the sake of doing the digital. I don't want my colleagues and the Ministry of Health to do anything that isn't very clearly contributing to the bottom line of every euro we put into healthcare leading to healthier, longer living Estonians. And that's also self-discipline that as a community, we digital people need to apply to ourselves, because sometimes we go out there with really cool schemes, costly schemes that don't deliver results, or that don't deliver, that aren't the most effective way of delivering results. And we need to have that self-discipline.
And Audrey, same question for you. What's next for Taiwan?
Yeah, in Taiwan, to use our digital services, if you speak perfect Mandarin, you have a really good life. If you speak really good English, you get a quite passable experience now. But if you speak like Daigi or Hakka or any of the 16 indigenous nations' languages, the experience, let's say, varies. And this is the same if you're interacting with, say, ChatGPT and so on, because simply there was not sufficient data to inform it fully of the interaction patterns of these languages. So for this year, we're focusing on one of our national languages, the Taiwanese Sign Language, because if you solve the sign language when it comes to the e-services and so on, a lot of the lower resource spoken languages kind of naturally falls in line, because sign language is the most distant to the written English or Mandarin. So we're focusing on empowering people who use the sign language, and then we're inviting people who innovate on digital service delivery when it comes to other languages, not just our 20 national languages.
Thank you to Lucas and Audrey for joining us today. We've talked about digital governance in Estonia and Taiwan and discussed whether digital innovation can sustain itself for a long period of time. If you like today's episode, be sure to subscribe, share, and let us know what you think. See you next time on Innovative Minds.
Hi, I'm Lucas Ilves. See you on Taiwan Plus.
Hello, I'm Audrey Tang, Taiwan's Digital Minister. See you on Taiwan Plus.